Dear all, welcome to all of you around the world and here in Glasgow, in COP. Really good morning. We are very happy to hold this session, and I'm very pleased to be able to moderate this important session on climate adaptation through infrastructure, risk resilience, and the governance. Alors, we are so sorry there will be a lot of noise, but this is our environment here in the COP, and we will have very soon our Vice President Timmermans having an event just in our door. So very sorry for any news. And now this session will give it to us the possibility to hear diverse perspectives on this issue, linking national to international approaches. And I'm very much looking forward to this discussion with our key speakers. But maybe before introducing the first speaker, allow me to say just a few words on this issue about under an EU perspective, because as you can imagine, governance is absolutely fundamental to tackle climate challenges, adaptation, and the resilience issues. Now, what we can say that it's clear that legal, political, economic system and the governance structure will determine how the changing climate will affect people, how people will adapt. And in order to ensure that science informs evidence-based policy making, and that there is a direct link between science, policy, and the action, this system, this governance, need to be fit for purpose. Now, as you know, now in Europe, we have set up our overall framework, our whole strategy for climate action, to have an Europe climate neutral by 2015. It's our European Green Deal. It's our, I would say, political signal for our partners to people that we care about climate, about environment issue, that we want to really act in this domain, and our Green Deal strategy is our step forwards to implement and to achieve climate neutrality by 2015. It's clear that we don't want to act alone in this domain. We want to work with our partners. We want to support our partners in our international partnership on climate finance. And this is the reason why in our new financial budget, 2021-2027, we have foreseen more than 35% of the global package that will be dedicated to climate-related issue, including everything that will be on adaptation and on mitigation. This will imply that for the next years, we will have a package of 27 billion euro that will be dedicated to finance action on climate. As you maybe know, the European Union has already adopted a new strategy on adaptation to climate change. And this strategy clearly underlines the importance of linking our internal and external dimension of adaptation with our partner countries. So clearly we want to work and support our partner countries to face the challenges of adaptation. Now, adaptation must also be informed by robust data and the risk assessment tools. Tools that must be available to all. So to achieve this, the strategy, our European strategy, propose different actions, pushing different tiers of knowledge to gather more and better data on climate-related risks and losses. Now, of course, gathering data and the policy design must be done in a coordinated consistent and systematic way. And this is the reason why the European Union will continue to cooperate with our partner countries for the development and the implementation of appropriate policies and the plans at all levels of governance. I mean, regarding the national adaptation plan, the national DRR strategy, or the nationally determined contribution. Of course, all this, when we talk about adaptation, mitigation, there is a direct link to finance flow. Now, it's a matter of urgency. We know, we understand very well the message that is here in Glasgow and around the world, and we wanted to ensure that we are there to support and to ensure that finance will be there. Of course, when we look to the finance, we need to look to the public, but also to the private finance. In our side, what we can say that we really want to ensure that at the least in the overall contribution, the adaptation part will amount to more than 60% of all the package. And of course, will be target-based infrastructure in the energy and in the transport sector. So we'll clearly pay attention for keeping a fair balance between adaptation and the mitigation. But allow me to say that globally, the international partnership, we want to play a key role on delivering the financial support to our development countries. And this partnership will continue to get a wider and deeper approach. And one of our news is the work that we are doing with India International Coalition of Disaster Resilience Infrastructure. And you will be listening about this, one of our key experts, Kamal Kishore, that will be with us in a minute. Now, so sorry, I take some minutes, but to give also the EU perspective, because it's very, very important, the clear message and also our EU engagement in this matter. And it's a key message that we are passing here in COP, and our President van der Leyen, our Vice President Timmermans are here to ensure that this message is clear to all our partner countries. But now let's move to our panelists, and allow me to introduce our keynote speaker today. Is ready. So I introduce you. It's Henk Ovink. It's the special envoy for international waters affairs for Netherlands. It's also the Sherpa to the high-level panel on water. Henk has a huge experience. In 2015, he has also been appointed by the Dutch cabinet as the first special envoy for international water affairs. He has served on President Obama hurricane sending rebuilding task force. And before joining the task force, Henk was both acting Director General on Special Planning and the Water Affairs at the Director National Special Planning for the Netherlands. Henk also teaches at Harvard, the London School of Economics, and the University of Groningen. So allow me to give the floor to Henk for its keynote introduction. Over to you, Henk.
Thank you so much, Carla. Thanks for your introductions, the welcoming words, but also the honor and opportunity to deliver this keynote speech to this important session during COP26. Water, climate, and resilient infrastructure are intertwined, as we know. First, let me say how proud the Netherlands is to be part of the CDRI. It has been a great partnership all the way from the Climate Adaptation Summit this January towards COP26, where we are now. We're looking forward to continue our collaboration in order to speed and scale up action on resilient infrastructure. Climate impacts us hardest through water. Then again, it is water that brings us together, forging partnerships like the CDRI to work on transformative and scalable approaches, investments, and projects to get us back on track. As the 2019 IPCC report, Climate Change and Land states, the majority of investments increase climate change, and that majority makes us more vulnerable. Single-focused investment aimed at solving only part of the complex puzzle. Especially since the last IPCC report underlined the dire consequences we'll face if we do not act now. Only this summer, where we again faced with the effects of our changing climate. Heavy rainfall across the world, but also in my home country and in Belgium and Germany, have cost too many lives with too many billions of euros lost on damages of critical infrastructure. Lives and investments that could have been saved. These disasters are proof that climate change is here and now, that it impacts all of humanity, north and south, rich and poor, and that our societies and our systems are not fit for this future of climate extremes. We need to ensure that existing and new infrastructure systems are resilient to these challenges. Mainstreaming resiliency has to be the norm for infrastructure governance and investments, and that is not a tick-the-box thing. That demands deep understanding of risks, vulnerabilities, and their interdependencies across economic, social, environmental, and cultural values. Resiliency is per definition holistic and comprehensive, cutting across all sectors, silos, and cultures. Resiliency is also per definition inclusive, bringing together everyone in all their capacity. And resiliency is sustainable, innovative, and even at best catalytic, aimed at the future, the long term, being a springboard for the change we need. It's essential to recognize this today at COP and to address the opportunity of talent and technology together to realize that norm. Climate change impacts every corner of the world in a different way. People and partnerships, the talent and technology, enable us to identify the risks and the vulnerability of climate change in systems, countries, and across borders, identify the many interlinkages, and with that, inform the opportunities, inform the improvement of our governance and infrastructure across all layers and divides in our society. An example is forecasting weather events, improving our ability to predict climate change and forecast weather events around the world. It is an important step in being able to manage the risks effectively and make smart decisions about how and where to invest in resilient infrastructure. But what we've learned is that forecasting itself is not enough. It needs to be coupled with capacitating society, investing massively in the enabling environment to ensure information is owned and carried forward. Example, cyclones in Bangladesh killed too many in the past. Their Bangladesh massive investments in early warning systems was coupled with communication, ensuring that everybody in Bangladesh knows about risks and the way to get out of harm's way. And that participatory process of developing early warning system also learned us that it's not only about when to leave, but also when to safely return, building trust in society in these systems and a level of ownership that is inspiring for the world. Resiliency is about people first and foremost. And we must improve our ability to see extreme weather events like floods and storms ahead in our weather predictions. After the event happens, we can then relatively quickly measure how much rain caused the actual floods and what the return time is in history of the amount of rain. And does it happen every 10, 100, or 1,000 years? And even more important, how will climate change influence the return time in the future? Being able to do these kind of predictions requires continuous access to a wealth of real-time observations from the entire globe. Surface-based observations play a foundational role. Without this foundational data, it is like navigating in the mist. In many parts of the world, the availability of such data is limited, and in several instances, even getting worse. That large data gap has a significant negative impact on the quality of weather and climate information, as well as on the current planning of infrastructure, as there is no information of what infrastructure should be resilient to. The efforts of the Netherlands, and many of our partners are geared towards making foundational data better available via the 3 years World Program of the Royal Netherlands Meteorological Institute. This work is complementary to the work of the World Meteorological Organization announced at the COP. The WMO started a large initiative for a systemic observation financing facility that will support countries to generate and exchange basic surface-based observational data that is critical for strengthening climate adaptation and resiliency across the globe. Both programs will particularly benefit the most vulnerable. In the Netherlands, we not only use the data of the Royal Netherlands Meteorological Institute, but we also use the information gathered from stress tests that identify and analyze the vulnerability of infrastructure to climate change. These stress tests are executed by the local governments. Our national work on adaptation is important as 2/3 of our country is vulnerable for flooding. More than half of our population lives in this area, and 70% of our GNP is generated there. Adapting to climate change is existential for us. Some even say that learning German must be part of our adaptation strategy. Private investors and insurance companies have pointed out that if they know the risks of non-resiliency and can put a price on it, it will be easier for them to get climate resilient infrastructure financed and built. This means that data on climate risks and the validation, evaluation, and valuing of these risks also helps incentivize finance from the private sector and can even contribute to public-private partnerships. Also, the Netherlands view as a way to accelerate action on adaptation. For that reason, the Netherlands funded the knowledge model on PPPs, which is freely accessible and provides information on how to integrate climate resiliency in infrastructure PPPs. Adaptation asks for an integrated, holistic, inclusive, and sustainable approach. It also offers the opportunity to ensure long-term progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, for instance, by ensuring access to safe water, sanitation, and hygiene, so critical important in the current pandemic, safeguarding the security, and help increase the position of women and the chances for girls, increasing equality across the globe. Besides talent and technologies and mainstreaming resiliency into governance at the local level, we also have to collaborate on the international level to accelerate and scale up action on adaptation. In 2023, together with the government of Tajikistan, the Netherlands honored to co-host the first United Nations Water Conference since 1977. We must use these action-forcing moments to synchronize our policies and implement adaptive solutions that combine local-scale action with global commitments. Lastly, I want to congratulate CDRI on its efforts towards strengthening infrastructure governance with the release of the white paper on governance for infrastructure resiliency. I look forward to hear about your experiences and knowledge on this important issue. I want to thank you for your commitment and your partnerships.
Many thanks for many thanks, Henk, for your very insightful opinion touching on earth observation on the early warning system. And thank you for providing so specific example of what is your experience in Netherlands. We come back to you during the answer a question session, and allow me to remind all the audience that they are invited to submit a question. Please use your chat, put your question in the chat, already indicates the person to who you address the chat, and we will come immediately to you during the question answer and the question session. Now, of course, we are running behind the time, and let me just remind the speaker that we have some few moments if we want really to have an interactive session. And now allow me to introduce immediately our second speaker, Kamal Kishore, that is just near to me. Kamal is the co-chair of the executive committee of the Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure, the CDRI. The CDRI is an international knowledge sharing platform to which the European Union was proud to join this year. and we will have a huge work together. Kamal is also a member of the Indian National Disaster Management Authority and has worked on disaster risk reduction and recovery issue for over 20 years at local, national, regional, and global events. And of course, before joining its management authority, has worked for 30 years for the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, in different countries, Geneva, New York, and New Delhi. So you can imagine how big is its experience and how many years has spent on advocating a campaign to address disaster risk reduction around the world. So Kamal, the words and the floor is with you. Over to you, Kamal.
Thank you very much, Carla, and I'm delighted to be here with colleagues from all over the world, not just in the panel, but also in the audience. It's a great opportunity to deliberate on issues of disaster risk governance, particularly with regards to resilience of infrastructure systems. So before I deliver my short remarks, I just wanted to say that over the last few months, we've been working with Arup, Resilience Shift and Resilience First. And we've produced a short white paper on disaster risk governance in infrastructure sectors. So let's watch a short video on it, and then I'll come back.
Infrastructure systems around the globe are increasingly at risk from a range of natural hazards and long-term climate change. These systems protect, provide, and connect our societies. As a result, the consequences of failure can be significant.
If infrastructure does not withstand extreme events, then evacuation of people in disasters get affected. When infrastructure collapses, then all the livelihood systems get affected.
Significant investment is planned in infrastructure in the next decade globally. This is partly a response to the economic recovery as we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the increasing urgency to decarbonize our infrastructure systems. Resources must be invested wisely to achieve high-quality infrastructure systems and services. Strengthening governance systems will ensure that infrastructure is of high quality, is sustainable over the long term, and is resilient to uncertain and emerging hazards and risks. The Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure and the Resilience Shift are collaborating to advance the debate on where opportunities exist to improve infrastructure governance. Through extensive literature review and engagement with governments and infrastructure practitioners around the globe, 7 key themes have emerged where opportunities exist to improve infrastructure governance to support the development of resilient systems.
O Ministério da Infraestrutura tem como uma de suas diretrizes socioambientais promover a inserção da mudança do clima na infraestrutura de transportes. A governança de uma iniciativa inovadora como essa requer cooperação e coordenação entre as partes interessadas, cujos valores e prioridades devem estar alinhados.
More recently, efforts have been made to integrate built infrastructure with nature-based solutions in order to sustain and restore valuable ecosystem functions and services. We have an opportunity to change the governance of our infrastructure for the better. This will ensure that these systems are resilient and provide significant benefits for both today's and future society.
Now is the time to act. We urgently need to improve the governance of our infrastructure systems. Governance is fundamental to our infrastructure systems, as efficiency and effectiveness of infrastructure can only be achieved through strong institutions and policies that ensure transparency and accountability.
Thank you very much. Henk Goving's keynote address very nicely set the stage for the discussion for this session. So there isn't really a lot to be added to that, but I, from this, the perspective of Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, I just want to lay emphasis on three key pillars of effective disaster risk governance, particularly for infrastructure resilience. I think the first point I want to make is that while there is a lot of emphasis now on making infrastructure resilient, a lot of this focus is at the level of assets. How do we go beyond asset level resilience to systems level resilience? So how do we expand the conversation so that we are not talking to only engineers, but we are also talking to finance ministers, so that at the upstream level, where large scale infrastructure planning happens across multiple sectors, resilience is really embedded in it. So that's my first point. My second point, again, drawing on Henk's keynote, he talked about the data gap that exists across the world, both in developing and developed world. Beyond the data gap, there is also an analytics gap. How do we make sure that the data, first, there is the data, which is there for the last 150 years, digitized. Second, we improve the density of our observational networks. Third, how do we use all of that to come up with analytics, which is understandable, usable, and actionable by a whole range of users involved in infrastructure development? So that's my second point, the hard task of putting in place the building blocks of data systems, analysis systems, and their communication. And my third point is that Henk talked about trust ownership in early warning systems in Bangladesh. I think that's really the key. Infrastructure is not about engineers. Infrastructure is about people. How do we make sure that we create a social demand for infrastructure resilience, for predictable, reliable services from infrastructure systems? So how do we create a people's movement? How do we enforce higher standards of transparency and accountability in the way infrastructure systems are set up and they are designed to deliver services to people? How do we set up systems so that people in general have trust and ownership in infrastructure systems that deliver basic services to them? So I think the people dimension of it is really important. The conversation on infrastructure resilience must involve people. It is not just about, financial planners and policy wonks. It is about everyone. So I think these are the 3 points I wanted to sort of emphasize. Focus on systemic resilience, invest in data analytics, make it understandable, actionable, usable, and 3, enhance people's participation, not treat it as an esoteric, specialized subject, but something that concerns everyone. Thank you.
Many thanks, Kamal, to have been so short, so clear, and on your significant points, the significant point that you have raised, from infrastructure to system, and the importance of data, the need to put people at the center. These are really key words. You know how much involved the European Union has been in supporting infrastructure and the system over the last decades. And I am really personally really excited to start working with you in the framework of the Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure. Now, we are just 6 minutes behind the timing, so we need to advance into the next speaker, and allow me to introduce him. It's a Professor Albert Klein-Tang. Albert is the director of the UK Met Office Adley Centre for Climate Science and Services. He's also professor on climate services at the Wageningen University. Before joining the Met Office in February 2018, Albert has been based at the Royal Netherlands Meteorological Institute for 25 years, and was also coordinating lead author for the chapter on atmospheric observation, the EPCC WGI 4th and the 15th assessment report. And you know very well the importance of the IPCC report.
So over to you,
Albert.
Thank you very much, Carla. And thank you for the opportunity to present some new evidence coming out of the EU projects to inform adaptation, risk, and resilience. And clearly, there are many more EU projects which have finished or are ongoing. And I can only provide a very sample, almost a condensed result of all the projects. So what I will do is I will focus on some of the projects that we have been involved in from the Met Office Hadley Center, and just to give you a flavor of what is coming out. Before I do that, on the next slide, I want to make sure that the issue of adaptation is really linked to mitigation. And one of the means we do this in the Met Office, we've used this to define new science requirements, is by framing it a little bit different. And if we go to the next slide, we will see that if it is, you can imagine a map and a destination with net zero as our future destination, and then the compass and the backpack. And if we frame it this way, adaptation and mitigation are much more linked together. And I think what is really important, and we've here at COP in Glasgow, we've heard it many times over the past few days, it is really important that a net zero future is not just a net zero future, it is a resilient net zero future. So the resilience part is really important. So the map and the destination is really about pathways and where do we end up with particular amounts of carbon emissions. The compass is really about monitoring and monitoring and attributing climate change we already see in the system. And this is also understanding where we already need to adapt and the current risks. And the backpack is really the services telling us what we predict for the future. So framing it a little bit different makes adaptation and mitigation much more closely linked together. Now quickly go to some of the example projects, and I've got a couple. The first one is, on the next slide, is the Helix project. Helix was coordinated in the Exeter University together with the Met Office. And you see on the map on the right, one of the major outcomes is that Helix was one of the first to define the outcomes and the impacts for different global warming levels. And of course, with the Paris Agreement and the focus on 1.5 and 2 degrees, it is really important to be able to express our results coming out of the climate science in these warming levels. And to the right-hand side, you see heat stress, global heat stress, a map of global heat stress, where the colors are red, heat stress is indicated to really increase strongly at a 2-degree global warming. And actually today we've revised these maps or updated the maps and also included exposure. So we really see that 1 in 8 people worldwide are affected by extreme heat stress under a 2-degree warming level. So this is really a way of one of the projects. If you go to the next slide, there is an example of the second project, which is EUCP. And this is really focusing on not only the longer term warming and the effects and the impacts and the increased resilience we need for the longer term, but also very much about the coming decade. So what is in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, the climate going to look like? And this project really focused on this connection. It was coordinated from the Met Office. And the project in this diagram, you see global temperatures in black is the observations. If we suppose we are back in the mid-90s, can we predict the coming 5 to 10 years? And that's what this project tried to do. And they were successful in linking these natural variation in the climate system with the longer term projections. The project also focused on more detailed mapping. Really, for resilience and for adaptation, you need local information. That was emphasized many times. So that means the climate models need to go to the local scale. At the regional models, we do this already. You see that on the right-hand side, where the observations are on the top, and you see that local, the more detailed regional models much better represent the observations. So this is not only needed with the regional for regions, it's actually needed at the global scale. And the next slide illustrates this, because at the global scale, there are interconnections between, for instance, the Atlantic Ocean and climate in Europe. And we can only model this, we can only understand this if we go to higher resolution global models. And of course, we know similar connections exist for El Nino and La Nina events. So it is really important that the global models, which are used for the IPCC and for the longer term projections, also go to a much higher resolution. So this is pioneering work in the Primavera project, which we also coordinated at the Met Office. I think in my final slide is the next slide. It is also to emphasize that mitigation has a clear link to adaptation. In this case, this project, Crescendo, was more or less providing the coordinating the European models and the input to the latest IPCC AR6 report. And the project has brought together the European state-of-the-art models, also including more Earth system processes than before. And in this case, you see a comparison in the maps where on the left, the models with only the carbon cycle interactively included. On the right-hand side, we also include land use changes and nitrogen cycle. And you see that carbon fluxes, uptake of carbon, which is important by land and by vegetation, is reduced if we include these nitrogen cycles. So more processes included in the models is really important. So this is ongoing work. These are projects that are more or less finished, but this is ongoing work. And I've just got 2 logos on the next slide just to finish off. Just again, it is important that these modeling systems continue to be evolving and continue to be improved. But that's not the whole story. Of course, there's already a large amount of data available. So it's these modeling system data available. IPCC has a regional atlas. WMO has an information portal. There's a Copernicus data store. It is really important that we also link this information to local decisions, and there needs to be kind of a transboundary, an intermediate process organized. And we do see many case studies where we co-develop these results and make use of the climate data and the climate information. But it is still not at a stage that it's easy to upscale. My climate scientists can, of course, engage with the local stakeholders, but there is only a few of them. So in that sense, we need to find ways of doing this. And that also links to the earlier presentations where I think systems are set up to do this. And I'll leave it here for now. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. Okay, try to close. Sorry for the rumors. Many thanks, Albert. Thank you so much for your presentation and for the highlighting the link between, once again, mitigation and adaptation. There are really exciting projects that you have presented today. Indeed, allow me to underline the Earth observation and the models that are, of course, fundamental to properly tackle the climate change challenges. And now, for the benefit of timing, let me continue immediately to our last speaker, Raquel Brisley. Raquel works at the global market research firm Ipsos Mori, and he's the head of energy environment for public affairs. Raquel has also a national and international track record in climate resilience and was a chapter co-author of the independent assessment of UK climate risk. She has over 25 years experience in the private, public, and the voluntary sector, working in the social, economic, and the physical regeneration. Raquel, we are all open to listen your last intervention before opening the floor to questions. Raquel, over to you.
Thank you, Carla. Okay, there's the slides, great. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. It's really great to be part of such an interesting and really important session. I'll be speaking about the 3rd UK climate change risk assessment, the evidence report for which was produced earlier. And this is a lot of organisations involved in this, particularly the Committee on Climate Change, the University of Exeter, Met Office, Hadley Centre, and numerous academics. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. So the requirement to assess climate risks at the UK level is actually set out in the Climate Change Act of 2008. And this basically requires that the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Secretary of State, produces an assessment every 5 years of current and predicted climate risks and prioritises those and lays that before Parliament. And the Act also requires the Committee on Climate Change to advise the Secretary of State on the preparation of each of those reports. Next slide, please. And so the sort of exam question, I guess, for the assessment, the issue that we were all asked to look at is based on our latest understanding of current and future climate risks and opportunities, vulnerability and adaptation, what should the priorities be for the next adaptation programme for England and the adaptation programmes of the devolved administrations of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland? And basically there's a number of risk areas and risks that were predefined through working with DEFRA and others. And for each of those risks went through a process of considering, what's the current and future level of risk? Is the risk or opportunity being managed with current adaptation? Are there benefits to additional adaptation in the next 5 years? And then looking at those sort of more urgent or watching brief type of risks and highlighting what adaptation activity is required. Next slide, please. So just sort of turning to the science and taking on points made by previous speakers about the importance of data, but then the importance of the analytics from that data, and then that it's widely understood, is the UK climate change risk assessment is underpinned by the UK climate projections 2018, UK CP18, and then looking at these in terms of a 2 degrees world by the end of the century, a 4 degrees world by the end of the century, and the aim of looking at adaptation that should fundamentally be able to adapt to 2 degrees, but understand the implications of the risks for a 4 degrees world. And the Met Office produced the science chapter for the climate change risk assessment. And this highlights those projections, but then also translates them into what these means for hazard on the ground. So things like the likelihood of wildfire, the potential for heat warnings, and also adverse impacts for rail, for example. Next slide, please. So across each of the risks, I haven't set all these out because you wouldn't be able to see it, but across the risk areas of natural environment, infrastructure, etc., 61 risks in total. 34 of these were identified as needing more action on adaptation. And in terms of infrastructure, the types of risks here which were included as needing more action is things like risk to infrastructure from cascading failures, from inland flooding, particular impacts of the transport networks from slope and embankment failure, risk to public water supply from reduced water availability, and risks to transport and digital infrastructure from high and low temperatures, high winds and lightning. It's not to say nothing's being done. A lot is being done in these areas, but it was basically saying there is a shortfall in terms of what's being done now and what needs to be done to manage the risks. Next slide, please. So this slide is highlighting the highest priorities for further adaptation in the next 2 years. Just to point out, sorry, something's gone wrong with the colours here. So in the corner, the magnitude of risk, the high is actually the sort of orange and the medium is the yellow. So just so it can be clear there that the high risks, those are in orange and the medium starting in yellow. So that these risks are basically the highest priorities need to be addressed in the next 2 years. The first 4 are linked to the natural environment and agriculture, and we've got impacts for food and food and services from impacts to supply chains. With regards to infrastructure, the highlight is around the risk to people and the economy from climate-related failure of the power system, and then also risks from overheating for human health, well-being, productivity, and multiple risks to the UK from climate change impacts overseas. Next slide, please. So this slide here is basically showing an overview of how the climate change risk assessment feeds into policy and practice. And so just from we've got the Climate Change Committee that leads the Climate Change Risk Assessment Evidence Report, which came out in June, and its biannual progress report on how well the government is doing on adaptation. The procedure then was going through briefings to Secretary of State to the chief scientific advisors, apologies for a number of abbreviations, and then government responds to the progress report and produces the government climate change risk assessment report, which will be early next year. And then following that, there's advice from the chief scientific advisors on relation to developing the national adaptation program, and the third adaptation program we produced in May 23. That's the England adaptation program. And then just to point out that devolved administrations of Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales do also produce adaptation programs every 5 years. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, sorry. I think there was some disturbance. Raquel, I lost you at final, but I think you have finalized your intervention, isn't it? Many thanks, Raquel. And now let's open the debate, or let's open the discussion. We are seeing some questions arriving, but waiting for the question. Maybe let me start with just a question to Hank. Hank, you have touched upon cooperation strategies, to your intention to share the Netherlands advanced model with some developing partner countries. Maybe you can elaborate in 1 minute what are your intentions, how you think to externalize your work on climate action? And over to you.
Yes, here I am. Thank you so much. Excellent question. I think the part of sharing knowledge and capacity is of critical importance. And this is something we've been trying to do, but also scale up as the Netherlands quite a while. And this is not that there is a Netherlands way of working on adaptation. It is a collaborative way. Adaptation is different in every place, in every system, and every culture around the world. So ensuring resiliency in our infrastructure really demands collaboration and grounding the knowledge that we have. The data, the capacity, the governance in the specific systems around the world. That is why the Netherlands is a driving force behind these collaborative actions, from understanding risks with data science and research. And one of the things when I started as Water Info, we started a new program on understand those challenges of water, climate and SDGs. It turned into a report, The Geography of Future Water Challenges, really grounding those facts on the ground and showcasing the interdependencies, and then starting to work with communities, governments, private sector and financiers, academics and experts, to ensure that what we learned from those vulnerabilities and interdependencies could be incorporated into policies, turning into projects and programs, and then be scaled and replicated. So part of the work we have in place is on the foundation of the Climate Adaptation Summit, the partnerships together with the UK and India and others, the CDRI, the Climate Action Coalition, the Water and Climate partnerships, all the way that we see 2023 as a action forcing moment for the world to come together on the issue of water and climate in the context of the UN. So I would say there are different levels of collaboration, very local in the context of vulnerability and opportunity, where we have to meet and match international partnership, but ground them locally and culturally. On the level of national governments, where partnerships and coalitions are of critical importance. Just referencing the Sendai conference in 2015, when the Netherlands started a Delta coalition, a coalition of countries that share the same burdens in the context of riverine, delta, and coastal vulnerabilities, but also riverine, delta, and coastal opportunities. That coalition was a foundation to inform action all the way to Quito and the urban agenda and the resiliency work and the adaptation summit we see. And then multilateral at the UN level, but also with our financial institutions. So I think working across these layers is of critical importance. And yes, we back this up with our financing, but that is never enough. It can only be a leverage to connect other financing opportunities with a collective of donors. Perhaps last, in my more diplomatic work, what I find in climate vulnerability, that there's often a lot of fragmentation on the ground in our systems within those places, but there's also a lot of fragmentation among donors. So donor coordination is of critical importance to be able, collaboration, to have an impact. And I think that is also one part what the Netherlands always tries to bring from this perspective of integration, inclusivity, and sustainability, is that coordination on the side of the partners is as much important as coordination on the ground. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Hank, for your underline once again now crucially is the coordination, the coordination between the donors, the coordination between the actors. Allow me to move to Kamal briefly, but I have a huge question for Kamal, because dear Kamal, last week here in COP, we have heard the Prime Minister of India announcing a net zero target by 2017. That, of course, for a country so big as India is clearly a challenge. What do you think? What you can say to us in a few minutes, how India is going to manage the challenge of a just transition? Over to you, Kamal.
Thank you very much, Carla. I think although there is a lot of focus, the Prime Minister made 5 announcements. The 2017 net zero target is only one of them. And all the other 4 are things that India has committed itself to doing by 2030. To me, it appears that even those 4 are as interesting as 2017. And with that, I think our Prime Minister has shown real leadership in the area of climate. On the adaptation side and on the infrastructure resilience side, I think we are entering into an unprecedented era of action in the next 10 years. And let me just highlight 3 or 4 dimensions of it. The first dimension of that is really connecting science to policy, connecting science to people. So I think you will see much greater emphasis, and in India as well as in the partnerships that we are involved in, where science is actually driving the evidence-based policy making for adapting to climate. The second thing is that there is a need in many countries to almost rediscover the wisdom that we had earlier. If you look at, I'll give you just the example of, the presentation earlier from the Met Office talked about the heat stress. And you look at the built environment that hotter countries like India have had traditionally. It is much more suitable to the climate that we've traditionally had than what we've been building in the last 30, 40 years. So there is almost a need to rediscovering our own way of life, our own traditional systems that have had much greater capacity to deal with climate extremes. To that extent, any adaptation effort, whether it is in India or in any other part of the world, must supplement the local resources, initiatives, and knowledge, and not supplant it with something completely foreign. So I think these are 2-3 dimensions on which we can see a lot of action in the coming years. I am very hopeful going from this COP26 that we are beginning to turn the tables.
Okay, many thanks, Kamal. I know that was really challenging to answer to this big question in 1 minute. Let's move with a last question for Albert. Albert, you talked on the importance of quantitative monitoring and the attribution to track our performance compared to our climate target. This is really a question that is high in the discussion here in a COP. What is your opinion? How integrate this track record into the economic and financial landscape in UK, for example? Share your experience. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Carla. A great, but also a very difficult question, to be honest. I think from the science perspective, the question is that it is to have an independent monitoring and evaluation of where we are on track, whether we are on track or not. And just to give you an example, with, for instance, emissions, there is nowadays, from the science perspective, we can, with Earth observation, provide more or less independent global coverage of emissions of many of the greenhouse gases, which I see can complement the more bottom-up inventories that are nowadays the standards. So in that sense, I think it is really important to make use of the latest science to complement the existing monitoring systems. I think when it comes to engaging more with the industry and with government, I think the climate change risk assessment that Rachel presented was already a good example in that respect. We need to do that more, but I also see the value of independent monitoring and more and evaluation. So it's I think it's ongoing work in that respect. Thank you.
Thank you. Last question for Raquel, and maybe Raquel, you can also start our last rounds, because we have just 4 minutes of us with allow me to say also that Kamal just also mentioned the importance of sensitizing citizens to climate costs. How do you see that? How can increase this issue? Over to you.
So I think I missed the beginning of your question there, but was it just about, were you asking about action, or were you asking just about sensitizing costs?
How you see sensitivities about costs?
Yeah, well, I think there was a really good point that somebody made. Maybe it wasn't here actually, maybe it was something I was watching yesterday, that this is about investment, not costs, when we're talking about adaptation. And it's really important to be aware of, you know, how much investment, basically the whole idea of investing now to save in the future. And so I think that is really where the priority needs to be, because in terms of the sort of triple dividend of resilience, when you're looking at avoiding losses in lives, promoting economic growth, and contributing to wider code benefits, adaptation is sort of the key to unlocking all of those. So I think it's basically about being very clear around how this is around investment rather than cost.
Many thanks, really, Raquel. And once again, on your points, our fundamental is linking moving from data and evidence to policy design. Allow me to say that it's really the key question that I am continuously asking to my team too. Just 2 minutes left in front of us. Allow me to thank really all our speakers, Hank, Kamal, Albert, Raquel, for their contribution how today in our panel. Of course, all these issues are very, very important issue, and we really hope to continue to discuss over to you, and we continue to contribute to these challenges with all our discussion. I think that we had the opportunity to hear different experiences that are illustrating not only how crucial governance is to reach our objective around the climate change, but also how multifaceted and interconnected all these components on governance are. And it was also the occasion to reiterate that the evidence, science, and the data have to underpin our public policy making. And it's really evident for the climate change debate, but also following the COVID pandemic, it's really evident that the proper research integration has to fit into the policy making, and all these remain significant challenges that we have in front of us. So many thanks to all of you once again for having listened our debate, and to our speakers to have taken time to participate in this many thanks. See you.